Okay, hey Script Apart listeners, welcome back to another episode of this podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. My name's Al Horner, and this week on the show, I'm delighted to be joined by Kwedar and Clint Bentley. Greg and Clint are the enormously talented writers, and in Greg's case, director, of the wonderful Sing Sing, a prison drama that tips on its head the entire prison drama genre, honestly. This is a film that forefronts humanity and tenderness instead of the violence and savagery that often powers movies set in prison. There are prison dramas I adore, don't get me wrong, Shawshank, Green Mile, Escape from Alcatraz, the list goes on and on. But how many times have we seen prisons depicted as ruthless pits where society's most dangerous animals are left to stew in their savagery? In Sing Sing, about a group of convicts who stage a play at the Sing Sing maximum security prison near New York, our characters, many of whom are played by real-life graduates of the Rehabilitation Through The Arts program seen in the movie, are depicted with a rare sensitivity. Whatever their pasts, whatever they've done, as this group of would-be thespians build towards the staging of a comedy titled Breaking the Mummy's Code, they're human to us in a way that cinema rarely affords. It's beside the point to say that this film is already being tipped for Oscar glory, with the performances of Colman Domingo and newcomer Clarence Maclin in particular being tipped for award season recognition. Whatever happens come award season is by the by, because this film is a fantastic achievement, which I think carries out an important social contribution. In the conversation you're about to hear, which begins spoiler-free, then gets into spoiler territory, don't worry, I flag where to turn off if you haven't yet seen the movie, Clint and Greg explain the genesis of this wonderful film. We talk about the magazine article that Greg read and found himself moved by, spearheading the entire project. We talk about the damaging trickle-down effect of how convicted felons are typically depicted in prison films, and how it shapes our perception and biases about them, getting in the way of their reintegration into normal life once they've paid their debt to society. And we talk about how the film does and doesn't rally against the injustices of the current prison system, opting for character moments and emotional intimacy for the most part, with the exception of one scene in a parole hearing that both breaks your heart and boils your blood simultaneously. This was a great conversation to be a part of. A massive thank you to Clint and Greg for being wonderful guests, and a massive thank you also to our Patreon supporters as ever. If you're a fan of the show and want to see us continue to grow, the best way to do it is to pledge the cost of a monthly cup of coffee on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/scriptapart and sign up, and in return you will get all sorts of great perks. Perks including ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, the chance to ask your questions to upcoming guests, and of course, as you may have heard me discuss on recent episodes, access to our brand new weekly writing hour. Our writing hour is a hangout on Zoom every Friday, in which for 60 minutes, writers from the Script Apart community can get their heads down in collective silence and get some pages written. It's been really wonderful to meet so many of you. Thank you to everyone who's signed up so far. If you would like to join the next writing hour, that address one more time is patreon.com/scriptapart. Okay, that is all the admin out of the way, so we can jump straight in with the wonderful Kwedar and Clint Bentley. This is their guide to the first draft secrets of Sing Sing. Thanks everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, and produced by Camille Demek. Greg, Clint, welcome to Script Apart. Such a joy to have you with us today. Greg, I'll begin this conversation with a question for you. In 2016, you found yourself in a maximum security prison in Kansas as part of a documentary crew, and you've described passing by a cell where a young man was raising a rescue dog. It stopped me in my tracks, you explained, because I saw the healing that was happening in both directions between this man and this animal. All my expectations about prison and incarcerated people were flipped on their head. Let's begin there. What were those expectations? How did they flip that day? And to what extent was this film designed as a way of giving audiences that same moment of revelation that you had in 2016, realizing that maybe there was some distance between who incarcerated people really are and the version of them that we're often served in media.
Well, I think you just said it right there. A lot of the expectations I had were built upon the movies I had seen. So my expectation was to have fear, you know, and instead I saw love and care. It's so abundantly apparent in that moment what was happening with that young man and that dog, you know. And very immediately it was also like that question of just like, is there anyone else out there like this doing things differently, you know? Because you felt its potency. You felt that whatever was happening right there, that was the work, if you will, quote unquote, of either, you know, one of two things is probably happening through a person's journey in prison if they're trying to find their way home. It's either what is it to rediscover your humanity, or what does it take to hold on to it in a place that's designed to strip it away? And also how do you find and be able to name and find space for, and sometimes healing and sometimes growth for the fullness of one's like personhood, you know? It's a very tangled web, you know, and having room to be able to do that work, even in 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 sometimes the simplest form of just like being responsible for the care of an animal, what that can open up. There's not a wide gap between that and a theater program. You know, they share far more in common than maybe we realize.
You mentioned there how cinema as a medium is arguably responsible for a lot of those misguided perceptions. As much as I love a lot of films and TV shows based in prisons, I did think after watching Sing Sing about, the impulses that those titles are often satisfying in viewers that perhaps aren't tethered to reality and, in fact, often kind of have an impact that doesn't benefit incarcerated people. Um, Clint, maybe this is one for you. What was your relationship to prison movies before coming to this project? And how did that relationship change as you began to steep yourself in the reality of incarcerated people and the lives they live?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I mean, my relationship to it and to prison movies was what we all have, and the conceptions that I had were largely those same terrible cliches. I have a couple of family members who have done time, but I had never been inside of a prison or anything like that. And I think when Greg first brought this story to us and said that he wanted to do it, the first step was we got in touch with Brent Buell, who had volunteered inside with Rehabilitation Through the Arts for a long time. And Brent Buell got us in touch with a lot of the alumni who had been through the program at Sing Sing and other facilities and were now out. And I'll never forget that first time we went up to New York and sat down with him, and we met a lot of the people who ended up being in the film. We met Divine I, we met Divine G, um, who Colman Domingo plays in the movie. Um, and and just you felt everything that all of the misconceptions that you have about somebody from prison and what you think of when somebody says an ex-con or a lot of these like harmful labels that are put on people. It just all went out the window, and it was just the exact opposite, where the people that we met and the people who've been through the program were such wonderful people and so lovely, and also like they've let down their masks in a way that we don't, us out in society, and it just like I remember both of us leaving and just being like, you want to be a better person and more open and more honest. And I think that's the thing, bringing it back around to film and to screenwriting, is like, it seems like it's not that like it does, you don't realize the full impact of just like seeing prison films and prison shows with these really negative stereotypes until you think about not just the impact of what that does to a viewer watching that and thinking about people in prison, but it also affects how they think about those people when they come out of prison. and they still carry those same labels and don't think about them as people, because they haven't been portrayed that way in media.
Yeah, so I guess the problem is these portrayals of prison life that we're typically served, they calcify into biases that then kind of either consciously or subconsciously lead viewers to having this kind of wary perception of them. And that translates into fewer job opportunities and things like that when they're on the other side of their sentences.
That's a much better and more succinct way to say what I was trying to say. So yes.
Not at all. It was beautiful how you put it. I'm kind of loath, guys, to talk about Sing Sing too much as, a quote unquote important film, though the issues raised in it are very important. I just don't want to do a disservice to how moving it is as a piece of entertainment, just on a human level. Like, this is not like a film that feels like homework or a film that feels like, you have to watch it because of that capital I importance. As a piece of drama, it's really fantastic. You have this set of characters who conjure so much empathy in you as a viewer as you watch them stage this play. I'm guessing from the earliest iteration of this film, that was always kind of the skeleton in the movie, the staging of a play, which, inherently has this kind of great cinematic structure in that you get to amass the characters and then you experience the highs and lows of rehearsals. You have characters who need to overcome inner problems in order to step out on stage. That's interesting, dramatic stuff. Then, of course, you have the looming matter of opening night as your ticking clock counting down to a closing spectacle. Was it always this play in particular, though, Breaking the Mummy's Code, that the film was going to be centered around?
Yeah, and the discovery of that was that first night in Kansas when I discovered, this young man with the rescue dog. I was in the hotel room that night. I got on Google and I typed who is doing things differently in prison, and that's when RTA like came up in the search field, and they had been covered in all like the major press, and they had done the classic plays. But there was this Esquire article from 2005 about one of the only originals they've done, their first comedy they had ever put on, which was this time traveling musical comedy called Breakin' the Mummy's Code. And it's a relatively short piece, but it was the tone, the tone was so magic because it was this literally insane play. I mean, like I can't overstate that enough. It has, it has dance numbers, it has rap numbers, it travels from ancient Egypt through the Black Plague and the Roman gladiator arena and like Old West gunfights and Sherwood Forest and like and on and on and on. And it was a 148 page. It had been written in one weekend by Brent Buell. Like all of that insanity is really there. And that, like, I think what was so magic about it, and like reading all the earlier press I had read, and like about the original, the other classic plays that they had remounted from Shakespeare to A Few Good Men and a lot of August Wilson's work. You saw the structure that you're speaking about, which is like the signposts of a plot architecturally of like casting to opening night, and so you have something that's moving along, and something Clint and I always talk about in our work is like we gravitate towards simple stories, like that they're sort of plot deceptively simple, but we always say it's like simple as the edge of a knife, because if you have something familiar like that sort of like urging us along in the story, we can then actually spend our time with the characters and mining, what's happening in the relationships and the nuances within their individual stories that is endlessly complex, and so like that was like an immediate pull. But the problem with dramatizing a lot of them mounting a drama or a tragedy inside of a maximum security facility, which is inherently dramatic, if you throw all that drama at someone in a story, it could yield a melodrama or just be like endlessly dour, and yet Mummy's Code, you just felt, when you watch a movie sometimes and you feel like the people who made that had a good fucking time, like making it. You just feel the joy of the process. Like when you read that piece, it was like you felt the joy. You felt the joy in what they're making. And even though like it seems so small stakes and like almost like feels very community theater and like maybe not something that would have risen to be a Tony nominated production, for the people doing it, it was life or death. It was everything. And it was also the juxtaposition of the light, the playfulness of the work, and the kind of the childlike expression of like kind of your first experience or discovery of how art makes you feel when you do it, against the environment it's set in, sort of holds kind of the spectrum of life within its palms. And that was so attractive to us.
And very important early on. I'll say, like, I know we'll talk about process in a second. We rewrote this script many times, like page one rewrites, in trying to find the right plot. But that early thing that Greg identified in reading that article of not only mounting a play inside of a prison, but mounting this play, and the tone that would yield, that always stuck. And it stuck early on, and it always remains. And it was just the thing where it's like, oh, there's a movie within that, and a good one, not a take your medicine movie or anything like that. And if anything, it makes the story even more potent and powerful, that like their lives are being changed, and they're changing their lives by mounting this crazy play, and that even that silly play is life changing, and it speaks more to the doing of it than what they're learning from King Lear or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. And in terms of your first draft of Sing Sing, guys, what were the rules that you set for yourselves, if any, in terms of what you wanted the film to show before you put a single word to paper? For example, it struck me that unlike a lot of prison media, it's not really dwelt upon or even referenced really what characters are in for. That felt like a purposeful decision because, it refuses to define characters by what they did in a previous life that landed them in prison. Instead, the film kind of defines them by who they are now in front of us. And, there's a beauty in that. I'm curious how many things like that were conscious decisions made right at the top before a single word was committed to the page. What can you tell me?
I mean, I think it was a process, to be probably most honest, because, we always attempt to listen more than we talk whenever we're developing a story and really coming into a community and spending time. And you can pick up, if you're in any conversation with, the people who have volunteered in the program, like Brent Buell, or the men who have come home, like if you're just listening and you're in that room, that's not what's central to their relationships or their conversation. And so that was something we were sensing early on. But our story education over this time, because this was an 8-year process, all told, as well as probably our moral education, we were evolving in more ways than one in making this movie. But the whole process of doing this work, and we learned this most explicitly when Clint and we became volunteers in the program ourselves. And so we actually taught, not at Sing Sing, but in another facility. It's also a maximum security facility in New York that RTA operates in, called Greenhaven. Nice sounding name, like a horrible place, a very, very awful place. Even it's baked into its design, the way it's designed on a hillside in Cold Spring, New York.
The walls are so big and thick. You feel like you're driving up to some like medieval castle, like, or dungeon or something. And it's like it was used as a POW camp during World War II. And you just walk through that place, and like the air is dead. It's just, everything about it is like, feels very dehumanizing. And the gates, and you just walk through this maze back to the room where RTA is working, and then you go in, you open the door and go in this room, and it just feels like the Wizard of Oz, where you've stepped into this other world, and there's so much light and life inside of it. And that was something always like that we were, in terms of your question of like what what were signposts, like that feeling was something we were always trying to get across. And it was something that it was really like in figuring out how to do that, and how to get it across in a script. It was always very elusive because we would talk to people about the story and pitch it and talk to people about the movie, and they would be like, that's amazing, that sounds awesome, like I can't wait to read that. And then we would send them whatever draft of the script we were on, and they were like, yeah, it's good, but it feels like it's missing that thing that you were talking about in the room.
Yeah. And to your point too on like about past, or defining like how these men have been defined by society or by the system and by vocabulary, like inmate, which is, something that as a movie we're actively trying to sort of help push people towards, what we call people first, and others have called people first vocabulary, of like always centering a person inside of it, of a circumstance rather than the circumstance defining their full self. And the program, which we learn very quickly as teachers, it forces and challenges you to meet someone as they are. And that's a big like sort of thing of sort of the process of acting is like in the moment, being present, the things that are, those are words that kind of like tossed around, but it is like a cornerstone of like the whole work that's done inside this program, and how liberating it can be, like to be there in the presence of someone and to feel what they're giving you and to give something back. And then the conversation is like, and what's next and what's beyond. And that's the, and that's where there's this room and capacity, to dream. And if you have now and then into the future without sort of the shackles of the past, that future can be quite unexpected. It could go anywhere, and also the very hard thing, the hardest thing about our work as teachers was we felt that very intensely and immediately when we came into the room that first night as teachers. But the scary ass thing is how these men expected that same openness and presence from us. And then you're like, oh wow, I got a lot I'm holding between this moment, and I have a lot of armor up, and I've got my masks, not just one, like several, and to shed that and then to feel the freedom of it, I haven't really felt that free, um as I did like when we really taught. I mean, I've had moments of it, and the moments of were actually when we kept getting to do this work and making this movie.
You know, everything you're describing there makes me feel like to have witnessed something as beautiful and kind of defiant as the RTA program, to have witnessed these people exposing themselves and being vulnerable in the program in this way, people who are finding hope and beauty in storytelling in a place that, from the sounds of things was architecturally designed to shut down hope. I can imagine a certain pressure coming with that. You must have been so desperate to do right by these people and honor the beauty of the program and the people in it. You've both alluded to a few times now, to the many drafts of this story before it became the Sing Sing that we now, know and love. Can you tell me what those drafts were like, and exactly how heavy the pressure was in doing justice to the RTA program and those engaging in it? It must have led to many iterations of that draft as you sought the most kind of authentic representation of what the RTA program represents.
Yeah, it was, I mean, it was something that like we had to, as Greg said, we've spent 8 years trying to get this film from the day that, Greg read that article to now releasing it. 6 years of that was writing and writing and rewriting and, trying to figure it out. And it was something we had to learn, I think, from doing other things as well and other projects. And it's always that element of you're trying to capture something real and honest in any film, right? And this one had something very special and tangible and magical about it. And film is just designed in every part of it to not do that, right? Because it's like trying to catch a butterfly and put it in a display where you have to kill the butterfly in order to do that, and then it loses the thing that makes it a butterfly. And it was something that we found just kind of iteratively on first Trans Pecos, writing that together and then making it, and um, and responding a bit to the world that was then coming, what the actors were bringing to it, and rewriting, you know, along the way as we're making the film. And then with Jockey, we took that to another level, in terms of, we rewrote half of that movie while we were making it, just to like, we shot on the back of in a racetrack with all these people, and who were really living this life, and they would just like, we would meet somebody who had an interesting story, or we'd find a place that was interesting, or we'd hear about wild horses on a river, and we're like, great, that's going to be a scene in the movie. And so then to like, that was a big turning point to help us figure out how to crack the code on this one, where, if I can distill it in any way, it was just something that we learned, as writers and as filmmakers and as people, that the more you can open up and release your grip on trying to do whatever you think needs to be done, the more you can open up and let the world in and let life into your project, the better it gets and the more alive it gets. And so within all of these iterations of Sing Sing and trying to figure out how to get the script right, it was in that process of opening ourselves up, that ended up cracking the code. And I'll let you elaborate on that, Greg.
Yeah, a big thing we've talked about for now well over a decade, you know, of writing, making films together, is that we aspire to tell stories from the dirt up, you know, and not try to jam a story onto a world, you know. And so it's about, like, another thing we also say is that, like, the characters in world are what's sacred and precious, and we fight very hard to sort of maintain that. And those things don't really change too much throughout, like, our development journey. They deepen as we learn more and discover more. But plot, we don't hold sacred, you know. Like, we'll completely throw it out, start completely over again, because we're always looking for, like, the better vessel, you know, to be honest to that, to what we'd experienced with this world and this character. Like, what is the arrow shot that you fire through that world? And so, you know, if we find a better, you know, mechanism to achieve that kind of deeper understanding, you know, of what we've been drawn into, then, like, we'll go for it, you know. And so I think the best way to encapsulate, like, there were three significant page one rewrites across the journey of the film. The first script that we wrote was probably closest to the article we read, and we were kind of just like drunk at a buffet, you know, because, like, you could you could make a movie about everyone that we met, and so we tried to do that.
Metaphorically speaking, though, you weren't actually writing drunk at a buffet.
Yeah, we weren't actually writing drunk at a buffet.
A metaphor, yes, I apologize. But yeah, it was kind of like Mummy's Code itself.
Drunk at the Golden Corral writing scripts.
You know,
That's how we always do it.
but no, but we just put it all in there, you know. And it was probably the most, like, documentary like, and, you know, wasn't really harnessing the power of dramatic storytelling to penetrate to maybe a deeper truth of what was happening and what we were feeling within the world. And it was too broad, you know, because there was no one to really attach to, you know. And the way we responded to that was we swung in the second draft to the complete other end of the spectrum and made the point of view insanely narrow, like single point of view, the whole movie seen through one person's eyes. There was the character and the protagonist was kind of a composite. It was sort of drawn together from a lot of the men that we met. We're still kind of trying to do everything again, but do everything through one character, you know. And that kind of fumbled because it was too narrow, and this is really a story of a community, so it didn't sort of ring true to, again, the experience. The other thing that was happening on writing those first two scripts that's important to note is, like, we would have these moments where we were in the presence of the men who were alumni around the breakfast table or in conversations, ourselves as teachers in the room. And we were always like, if we could just, again, take how this moment felt, if this whatever this is, if you could just put that into a movie, like that's it, that's what it is. But then we would go away and put our writer hat on and be like, we got this, like we'll see y'all later. We'll be back with the script, and we'd bring it back in, to Rue, and you'd read it back, and it's just like it just felt like an imitation, of what that room had. And like the reason that I think it was falling short is like, and the thing that we had to learn was the breakthrough, if you will, was when we allowed our writing process to mirror how the program actually operates, which is as a community, it's a community storytelling vessel. And so the storytelling and the writing needed to reflect that. And the kind of final big breakthrough into the third draft was, we had known the real Divine G and Divine I, who are, the stars of this film, from that first breakfast 8 years ago, and had carried on a relationship with them. And the breakthrough was like, oh, in the beginning we were so broad, and in the second draft we were so narrow, that maybe the way to kind of hold space between those two dimensions is to tell the story of a friendship, and to have these two men who in real life could not have been more different from each other, would not have been friends probably outside of this circumstance or this program, but because of it, they became closer than family. And it felt like, we could see the galaxy, of all of this through their relationship and the ride that they take us on. And then also it had enough room for the actual community to swirl and circle around it.
That's really beautiful. And I do want to come back to the way in which the making of this film was kind of mirroring the story that you were telling in the film, because that's a whole interesting meta aspect to Sing Sing. First, though, I want to pick up on something you mentioned there about the breakthrough of realizing you could center the film around this friendship, this unlikely friendship. Tell me who these two characters were to you, Divine G and Divine I, because, they have an incredible partnership that they're able to form despite their differences in the movie. How did you construct each character as possessing what the other character kind of needed in some way in terms of perspective?
Yeah, a lot of that was just really based on what we knew of them, and kind of taking a lot of different elements from their friendship and from them as people, and they share a story by credit with us, and that's not an empty gesture. They like helped us shape a lot of those stories, and a lot of the overall arc of their friendship through us working with them on telling that story. But it was, when Greg kind of landed on like this idea of like, let's do it through this friendship, it then became this opportunity of Divine G being someone who's a bit older than Divine I. Divine G helped start this program. Divine G is somebody who helps everybody else out around him, but never asks for help. And he's in there as this is all true about Divine G, and he's in there as somebody who did not commit the crime that he's in prison for. He's been wrongfully incarcerated. On the other hand, you have Divine I, who's younger than him, who is a self-proclaimed yard bandit, one of the most feared men, and he was one of the most feared men in Sing Sing, and starts by, there's something that draws him into this program, but he doesn't quite know what it is, and he says different, reasons for why, but there's something there that maybe he doesn't even understand himself. But then he comes in and just shakes the thing up, and just kind of asks for a comedy, doesn't even care if he they do a comedy, he just wants to ask for a comedy, ask for something different. And then the meeting of those two men, not only what can draw them together, but what can push them apart, those being the same things, seemed really interesting to us. And there was this one moment where they told us about Divine G ran the NAACP within the prison, the branch of the NAACP within Sing Sing, and just all of the like logistics of that. And they told us about one night where it was Divine G was working late on some paperwork and was just so frustrated and flustered, and Divine I came in and just sat with him and just chopped it up and tried to cheer him up a bit. And just that moment of just felt like there was a a whole universe of a story within that, interaction.
I think the moment in the film that really got me emotionally and where I was like, oh no, it's got its hooks into me now, is the scene early on where Divine I takes a role that would have been Divine G's. And lots of things are kind of playing out in that moment, and they're all happening wordlessly because a lot of these characters aren't characters who verbalize what they're feeling oftentimes. So in that moment, Divine G feels hurt. Obviously, he feels pain that this role that would have been his has been handed over to someone else. But there's also kind of this want that you read on his face of wanting to process the pain and wanting to move through it. He wants to accommodate Divine I being involved because he recognizes how useful the RTA program has been for him, and he wants that for other people. In that moment, though, seeing that pain etched onto Divine G's face, like, you are aware how much of a life raft the RTA program is for him. And it's interesting, these quiet moments, they're what sustains the film. And often the task for the actor is to explain that complicated emotion visually because these characters aren't talking aloud. So that must have posed a challenge for you on the page. Can you talk to me about like the challenge of getting that aspect of Sing Sing right on the page?
The script we ended up shooting, this third draft, kind of has three pillars. The anything that sort of had to do with their friendship, any scenes where that was the kind of primary focus, which is also the spine of the movie, that was very scripted, and all the dialogue was there. I mean, but we weren't precious about the dialogue, but we would always again encourage that to come alive and to find its way into everyone's own mouths and their own distinct voice. The second pillar would be like mounting Breakin' the Mummy's Code, that process from casting to opening night, and there we really intentionally like loosen and not try to define everything that's happening on the page and that will ultimately come up in the screen, but it also still has dialogue that's planted within there. That tip my hat to Clint for that. I was kind of like, we're just going to make Mummy's Code again. We're just going to put the show on and, follow it through. He's like, we should write it a little bit, and thank God for that. But we planted dialogue within that, but we didn't try. We wanted some of the chaos of putting a show on. We didn't want to sort of, squash like the room for that to sort of come alive in front of our eyes. And a great example of that is the audition sequence in the movie where there's several things going on in that. It's the main time we meet the broad ensemble, and they first finally really come in front of the camera. And so on the page, all we wrote was the men auditioned for Breakin' the Mummy's Code. They pick roles that they most identify with. Some are prepared, some are not prepared. And then we ask them some personal questions, and what then sort of happened on the screen is, we encourage the cast, to pick whatever role they wanted to audition for, come in front of the camera as prepared or as not prepared as they wanted to be. And some were prepared and some were not prepared. And it just like brought this live wire energy. And then we held back some questions for them that they didn't know we would ask. And those questions range from the silly to the profound, which we also wrote that into the script as well. of like, why do you love acting? Why did you join RTA? What other roles have you played in other productions? Tell us a childhood story. Fight an imaginary gladiator. Sing happy birthday to us. Or what are you most afraid of? And out of that, it would move from like that intense vulnerability of really auditioning for something again. We were able to capture that because we didn't try to define it too much. It brought that nervousness to the making of it. And then when we moved in those questions, it kind of migrates into this confessional space. And then we return to this scripted when Colman comes up and, he does his full monologue for Hamlet trying to earn the role. And what's interesting about that scene from a dramatic standpoint is everyone that comes in front from the alumni cast in front of that camera, they're so open, kind of like how we described when we were in the room as teachers. And then when Divine G, Coleman's character does his monologue, he's performing there, and you feel a barrier, even though it's excellent, technically, it lacks the vulnerability that we've just sort of witnessed, which is kind of marking where he is in his journey of like, oh, he is kind of the guy in this program and he is very warm and generous and all this stuff, but he's withholding far more than everyone else is, and then the last kind of pillar of the writing is truly unscripted moments that we created space for, and learned a lot of this in our previous film Jockey that Clint directed, of create a space which would be these circles for acting exercises, where there's one in the movie called Imagine a Perfect Place, and that is just a prompt from Brent, played by Paul Racy, to have the men close their eyes, imagine this perfect place, and then when they open their eyes, they responded completely in their own words. And so these kind of three, kind of pillars, like within the script, kind of enabled us to chase and capture again the spirit of how it felt in that room.
And to just piggyback on that a second, because of what you're like, it's something from a craft level that we've spent a long time trying to figure out and are still trying to figure it out, which is like, how do you create a moment like that first to set the intention on the page, that what you're talking about, of where Colman just gives a look, right? He just gives kind of half of a look, but you as a viewer, as an audience member, you get all this wealth of feeling and information from it, from that single look. And a mentor of ours, Larry Andres, who's a great writer, has this saying of like, you only use dialogue as a last resort. And that runs counter to what you think as a screenwriter, but it's really true. And, it's something you just like, I think we're still learning it, and we'll probably continue to learn it until we're dead, of just how do you set that intention enough where everybody gets what they need to do, but then how you have the openness on the day to be able to throw it all out, because sometimes you do have to overwrite it, and sometimes you do have to write the unfilmable of like, he's feeling this in this moment, or sometimes you have to write kind of the on the nose dialogue, and then but you have to be smart enough to know, like, when you get into it, when to throw it out, and when to just let the look happen, or let the feeling of the moment communicate that big thing.
Okay, this is somewhat getting into spoiler territory, this next question. So if you haven't yet watched Sing Sing, pause now before we go on, because I don't want to ruin it for you. Okay, so guys, the most heartbreaking moment in the film, I think, comes during Divine G's clemency hearing. His involvement in the program is a life raft to him, as I described earlier, and it's something noble for all these other people who he's incarcerated with. But that good deed is kind of thrown back in his face by the panel that he's in front of, who basically insinuate that he might be acting in front of them because he does this course that, trains his dramatic muscles. This then sparks a very understandable meltdown as he comes back to the production, and he has this really important line during the ensuing meltdown. He says, "You say trust the process, but the process is fucked." And in that moment, it feels like he's not just talking about the play. He's talking about something larger, and It is interesting that the film doesn't rage too much at the brokenness of the system, because that's not the story that you're telling here. Maybe that's information we already know, how broken the prison system is. But in that particular moment, the brokenness seems to be seeping through, and it feels like Divine G is talking at he's talking about something larger than what we're seeing on screen. Can you tell me how you approached all this, and how you approached that scene, guys? Because as I say, it is so moving.
So what's fascinating about that hearing itself was, even from the when we were finally arrived at this storyline, for the what became the third draft, and it came pretty fully formed. Like once we discovered it was like a lot of these central beats, and like that wanting to use these as like a silent ticking clock, these a parole hearing for Clarence and a clemency hearing for Divine G just kind of like sit on the horizon, and just kind of, even if it's subconscious, there's sort of it pressurizes sometimes the playful work that's happening in the rehearsal process, that is kind of coming towards us like a train. And when it finally gets there for Coleman's character Divine G, when we were contemplating writing that, I remember I was came across this in the New York Times one day. It had published an actual parole transcript in the Times, and I remember reading it and being so riveted and at times horrified by what I read, just kind of in just black and white print. And I think one of the things that was so affecting about reading it was, for the commissioners on one side of the desk, this was one of maybe 15 cases they were doing that day, and it's very almost banal to them. And for the person on the other side of that desk, it's they're fighting for their life. And that felt so it felt so traumatic. And even though it might be happening in a very like nondescript setting, like the proceedings are of the highest drama. And I remember calling Divine G after I read it, and I was like, I just had this idea for the clemency hearing. Like, what if we, because you can go online and you can find these like actual transcripts, and like you can print them out, and maybe we can just grab little bits from a bunch of them and stitch together, the scene of your hearing. And he was like, wow, that's really interesting. Or you could just use my transcript. And this was the transcript that is in the film actually happened to him. He was actually asked if he was acting in this interview. And the only kind of liberty we took was taking his parole hearing transcript, which happened at 25 years when he was finally released, because that was published, and brought that onto his clemency hearing, because those records were sealed, of the proceedings that happened in that room. But what was said in that hearing is what's on the screen. And I just even remember like the day we were shooting it and directing Colman, like when he gets asked that question, are you acting in an interview? His first instinct was like, no, what? No, like to really fight back, and to still kind of like hold on to hope. And I remember after we did one take that way, and I pulled him aside, I was like, when she asks you that, it's over, you know, like there's no coming back. Like there's no coming back from that. And he's like, oh, that's a great note. Thank you very much. And then we shoot it, and you see all the life fall out of his face in about 2 seconds. And when you're talking about creating space for actors to do it, if you have done the work and earned a moment like that, and you can that then an actor can then take it from there.
Yeah, which I think is a good segue into that breakdown scene where he breaks down on stage. Which when we wrote that, it was always a moment the film was driving to, and it's just it's one of those scenes that, like, if you've done the work leading up to that scene, it kind of writes itself, right? You've created this character, and everything's led into that moment, and then you're just writing this thing where this person is kind of just letting it all out for the first time, um like really letting it all out, and because he's bottled it up for so long, then it comes out in an unhealthy way. um but I remember, the thing to mention about it is again, kind of what we're talking about of like trusting the process and trusting your actors. Of we had that that kind of breakdown was really carefully scripted and really good on the page, and yet there were sections of it that like just were cheesy when you hear them out loud, and kind of trusting Coleman to work with us in that scene as you're workshopping it and cut out the bits that like you say them and they're really nice words on a page, but then they destroy the emotional truth of what you're getting in the moment. um is the thing to remark on there, I think.
I'm so glad that the ending of the film allows him kind of a moment of freedom, a moment of beauty, seeing him through that car window, enjoying something as simple as the breeze against his face. It's so special. We're running out of time, guys, so I will ask this one last question, and hopefully it's not too broad. But I was just amazed, basically, to learn after watching the film that only 3% of RTA participants return to prison, when I think the national average of being kind of reincarcerated after serving one term is over 60%. So that is a huge gulf that I think speaks to the rehabilitating nature of engaging with art. And yeah, the question I wanted to leave with today is whether or not the experience over the last 8 years of both teaching on the RTA program and then making this film, whether it led you to any new conclusions about what it is about art and creative play that reconnects people who've experienced hardship to something softer within them, something even redemptive, maybe. Were there any new realizations along those lines that presented themselves to you in the process of making Sing Sing?
I think it's something that like, yes is the short answer. It definitely like it changed my life and changed the way I even being a working artist and being an artist from, we've been artists from the times we were kids, and we were lucky enough to uh be born into situations where that could be fostered, and not pushed out of us, and so we're very lucky in that way. But even saying that, like going through this process and making this film, I really stepped away realizing the power um of just the creation of the art, whatever it is. And that really struck me as we were leaving, uh when we wrapped production, as we were leaving New York, and just feeling like there's this big emphasis in America specifically on that something's not worth doing if you're not going to become famous at it, or if you don't get paid enough at it, whether it's writing or pottery or painting or whatever. It's like, or acting. It's kind of like looked down upon if it's like, well, are you a professional or not? And it really, I think it really cheapens the experience and what art can actually give you, whatever form that art is taking, whether it's writing or acting or whatever. Um, and it robs the joy from a lot of people who would be able to participate in that. And I think that's the thing of, yes, if you're in a really difficult situation, and a really terrible situation like prison, where you have like a lot of traumas, like, absolutely. But I think even broader than that, like, it just reminded me of that everybody needs this in some way. It really, like, it unlocks, um it just unlocks something special within you, that it's really hard to find that um in any other way.
I mean, the case that I think the movie is making, and maybe why it's resonating as broadly as it is, and also very specifically for a lot of people at the same time, is the kind of rebellion of, like, despite the miles of razor wire and the heat and this the lack of freedom of movement, like everything always being watched, like, every aspect of, like, how being incarcerated sort of is designed to strip individuality, to strip your spirit down, and to kind of crush your will. um Despite all that, like, art can be created here. It's pretty is really bold, and read really loudly to, I think, any of us that watch it, of like, if it can happen there, it can and should be happening everywhere. The reality is like, most of us um, can find ourselves in prisons of our own design too, and may currently be in one, invisible one, and or circumstance, or any of the things that might afflict us, of which there's a myriad in the world that we live in. Um, just the power of like mindset, of just, we don't have to settle for misery, like we can choose joy, and it's an active choosing, and we have to continue to do it, and we need community. You need uh people around you to kind of unlock, I think, the most beautiful part of yourself. um and I don't know, I think that this is a story that I'll continue to learn from, you know with time. I don't think it's going to calcify. I think it will keep working on me, as long as I'm alive.
That's really beautifully put. And a great note to end on, guys. I should let you go because, you've been really generous with your time today. But let me just say first, thank you so much for this film and so much for this conversation. It's been a total privilege, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been an honor. It's been amazing.
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised because I listened to the show, but just to get to be in the room for it was one of the deepest and more meaningful conversations we've had on the road. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Al.
You've been listening to Script Apart. Thank you so much for tuning in. A reminder that if you want to help the show continue to grow, you can join us on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart or clicking the link in today's show notes. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.